As investigators search for Savannah Guthrie's mother, Nancy, today authorities providing the most information yet, including new details about that purported ransom note received by multiple news outlets.
She has interviewed presidents, broken the biggest news on television, and held her composure through it all. But on the morning of June 8th, Savannah Guthrie sat on the Today Show set and could not stop the tears. Her 84-year-old mother vanished from her own home in the middle of the night more than 4 months ago, taken by a masked intruder who has never been caught. Now investigators say they may finally be closing in, using a technology that has never solved a case like this before. The night Nancy vanished. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old, a longtime resident of Tucson, Arizona, living alone in the Catalina foothills, a quiet suburb tucked against the desert mountains. On the evening of January 31st, 2026, her son-in-law dropped her off at home after dinner. It was the last time anyone in her family saw her. The next morning, February 1st, Nancy failed to appear for a church service she watched and participated in every week. For a woman of fixed routine, that absence was immediately alarming. Her family raised the alarm. By that afternoon, the Pima County Sheriff's Department was at her home, and what they found turned a missing person report into something far darker. Nancy's cell phone was still inside. Her wallet was there. Her car was in the driveway. Nothing that a person would take if they were leaving on their own had been touched. And there was blood on the front porch. There was one more detail that helped investigators build a timeline of that night, and it came from an unexpected source. Nancy wore a pacemaker, and that pacemaker synced data to her smartphone. Investigators were able to use the device's last sync, around 2:30 in the morning, to help establish when the ordeal likely ended. A medical device meant to keep an elderly woman's heart beating became, in the worst possible way, a witness to her final hours at home. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos stood in front of cameras and said the words that no family ever wants to hear about a loved one. He said they had a crime scene. He said they had a crime. He said Nancy Guthrie had been taken from her home against her will. This was not a woman who had wandered off. This was an abduction. And the person who took her had left behind exactly one image of himself, captured on a camera he thought he had disabled. The man on the porch. The Guthrie home, like millions of American homes, had a doorbell camera. What the intruder did with that camera would become one of the most studied details of the entire case. On February 10th, the FBI, which had joined the investigation alongside the Pima County Sheriff, released footage from that camera to the public. It showed a masked figure approaching the home in the dark. The person was armed. He held a flashlight in his mouth to keep his hands free. And in a chilling, deliberate move, he reached up and covered the camera lens with vegetation, with leaves and branches, to blind it. The doorbell camera was disconnected at approximately 1:47 in the morning. The FBI's forensic analysis described the suspect as roughly 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches tall, with an average build, wearing a black 25-liter hiking backpack. Online, true crime communities gave him a nickname that stuck. They called him Porch Guy. There was a detail about the camera that obsessed investigators and armchair detectives alike. The intruder did not just cover the camera. At some point, the camera itself was taken, and the question of why he would bother to remove it became central to one expert's theory about what really happened that night. Because a man who takes a camera is not just trying to hide his face. He may be trying to hide something else entirely. But before we get to that theory, there is a piece of evidence the family has been begging the public to help with. And it is the reason Savannah Guthrie broke down on live television. The anchor who cried every morning. Savannah Guthrie has been one of the most composed figures on American television for more than a decade. As co-anchor of the Today Show, she has reported through national tragedies, interviewed sitting presidents, and maintained the steady calm that the job demands. When her mother disappeared, she took a leave of absence of roughly 2 months. She returned to the show in early April. But returning did not mean she had healed. On June 8th, filling in alongside Jenna Bush Hager, Savannah broke. Within the first couple of minutes of the broadcast, the composure cracked. She told her co-host and the audience that she cried every morning on the way to work and every morning on the way home. She said it was almost too much because to do the job, she had to hold it together, pull it together. She said she had been trying so hard. A source close to the show told Entertainment Tonight that the moment was not produced or planned. It was simply a real conversation between two friends, one of whom was living through an unimaginable nightmare while reporting the news every morning. And in the middle of that emotional moment, Savannah did what she has done repeatedly since her mother vanished. She begged. She pleaded with anyone who might know something to come forward. She said she wished someone would call and say what they know. This is the heart of the family's struggle. Sheriff Nanos has explained publicly that this kind of case does not get solved the way it does on television, where a detective talks to a witness and makes an arrest the same afternoon. He said what really prolongs it is the reliance on labs for DNA testing and the absolute need to avoid arresting the wrong person. The family has put up a reward that, according to the sheriff, now totals more than $1.2 million for information that helps find Nancy or those responsible. It helps to remember who Nancy Guthrie actually is, beyond the headlines. She was born in 1942. She spent years working at the University of Arizona. She was widowed in 1988 when her husband Charles died, and she raised 3 children, including Savannah, who would grow up to become one of the most recognizable faces in American news. Nancy was a woman of faith and routine, the kind of person whose absence from a Sunday church stream was alarming, precisely because she never missed it. She was not a stranger to anyone. She was somebody's mother, and that mother is the one now at the center of a national search. More than 13,000 tips poured in during the early weeks. Later reports put the number closer to 18,000. And yet, 4 months on, no suspect has been publicly named and no arrest has been made. The case had seemingly stalled, until investigators turned to a tool that has never been used at scale on a case like this: the new weapon in the investigation. In the months since Nancy disappeared, a security and intelligence analyst named Morgan Wright has become one of the most prominent voices analyzing the case. Wright is the founder of the National Center for Open and Unsolved Cases and the host of a podcast called Crime Reconstructed. He has appeared across multiple news outlets, walking through what he believes could be the breakthrough. His theory centers on artificial intelligence, and specifically on a kind of analysis he learned from his background working alongside intelligence and defense agencies. Wright explains that the techniques being applied to the Guthrie case have their roots in how the United States hunted high-value targets overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan. He references a system built by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency that loitered over an area collecting massive amounts of high-definition video. When an attack happened, analysts could rewind, see who was nearby, and trace vehicles and people backward and forward through time. The idea, applied to a quiet Arizona neighborhood, is this: investigators are not just looking at the doorbell camera. They are pulling in everything: license plate readers, traffic cameras operated by the Arizona Department of Transportation, nature cameras set up in the nearby preservation area, some of which face the road, video from neighboring homes, video from local businesses, cell phone location data, and a category most people have never heard of, called ad tech data, the location information that mobile apps quietly collect from phones. The breakthrough, according to Wright, comes from feeding all of that into AI and asking it a specific question. Show me the vehicle, show me the person, that exhibits a pattern of behavior consistent with surveillance and a targeted abduction. Not random movement. The pattern of someone who scouted the location in advance, who cased the home, who knew exactly when to strike. And this is where his theory about the stolen camera becomes critical. Wright argues that the intruder was strangely comfortable standing on that porch in his disguise for several minutes. He did not seem worried about being seen. So why take the camera? Wright's answer is that the man was not trying to hide his own face. He was trying to hide his vehicle. If the camera had captured the car, it could be traced. By removing it, the intruder protected the one piece of evidence that AI analysis is now built to chase across an entire city. the pattern of a predator. The most unsettling part of Wright's analysis is what he believes the evidence reveals about how this crime was planned. He describes a sequence that intelligence analysts have identified in terrorist planning cycles, and that he believes applies to targeted abductions as well. It begins with broad target selection, then initial reconnaissance, then specific target selection, then rehearsals, then, finally, action on the objective. People who commit these crimes, Wright argues, move through these steps in a way that is observable, even when they do not realize they are doing it. If the intruder stayed carefully outside the range of known cameras, that itself is a tell. Avoiding cameras requires knowing where the cameras are. Knowing where the cameras are requires advanced surveillance. The absence of footage in certain areas becomes its own kind of evidence, pointing to someone who studied the neighborhood before the night he struck. Wright draws a comparison to a case many people will recognize, the Idaho student murders, where the suspect's phone records showed a pattern of the device being turned off and then back on. He calls that a red flag. When someone shuts off their phone at a critical moment and then powers it back on later, the very act of shutting it off becomes a signal worth investigating. Why turn it off unless you knew it could be tracked? He also points to how a similar real-world breakthrough actually happened in the Long Island serial killer case. People assumed DNA solved that case. Wright argues it did not. The original lead came from going back through old data, identifying a specific vehicle, and combining it with cell phone records to develop a suspect. The DNA only confirmed what the data work had already uncovered. His point is that AI does not replace that hard investigative work. It accelerates it, doing in a fraction of the time what would take human investigators months, and surfacing connections that a tired human mind would miss. There is a catch that Wright is careful to acknowledge, and it matters for whether any of this leads to a conviction. Evidence gathered with the help of AI has to survive a courtroom. The question a defense attorney will ask is not whether the AI is clever, but whether the evidence it pointed to was collected legally, and whether the human investigators made the actual decisions rather than letting a machine decide for them. Techniques like DNA analysis and fingerprinting are admissible because they have been scientifically validated and accepted by the broader scientific community. Newer AI tools have not yet cleared that bar. Wright stresses that transparency is everything. If investigators cannot show exactly what they did and how, the holes in the case will be found, and they will be found by the defense. He also raises a deeper warning about how investigators think. Human beings rely on mental shortcuts. They reach for the explanation that makes the most immediate sense, and in doing so, they sometimes leap from evidence straight to a story, skipping the careful interpretation in between. One of the most valuable things AI can do, in his view, is strip away that bias, force investigators to go back through everything they assumed they already understood, and expose the things they missed the first time. But for all the promise of this technology, there is a dark side to the AI attention this case has attracted, and it is something the family has had to fight against directly. The hoaxes that hurt. Here is the new insight that most coverage of this case has not made clear. The same artificial intelligence that may help solve Nancy Guthrie's abduction has also been weaponized against her family. In the months since she disappeared, a wave of fabricated, AI-generated content has flooded social media and video platforms, designed to look like real news. Fact-checking organizations including Snopes and Lead Stories have traced much of it back to overseas content farms, including a spam network operating out of Vietnam. These hoaxes are cruel in a way that is hard to overstate. Multiple AI-generated videos falsely claimed that Nancy's body had been found floating in a pond near the Catalina foothills. Snopes traced one such video to a channel that had stitched together unrelated footage, including police activity from Minnesota and the aftermath of a fire in Switzerland, laid under an AI-generated news anchor voiceover. None of it had anything to do with Nancy Guthrie. The body was not real. The discovery never happened. Other fabricated stories falsely claimed that members of Nancy's own family had been arrested, that her daughter was in police custody, that a son-in-law's home had been blockaded by police. Lead Stories debunked every one of these, tracing them to the same kind of automated spam operation designed to farm clicks and outrage from a grieving family's worst moment. There was even an episode where social media users took the real FBI footage of the masked suspect and ran it through an AI image tool, asking it to remove the mask and reveal the face underneath. The result was not evidence. It was a completely fabricated face, invented by the software out of nothing, that could send investigators or vigilantes chasing an innocent person who never existed. This is the double edge of the technology at the center of this case. In the hands of trained investigators working with lawfully collected data, AI may be the thing that finally identifies who took Nancy Guthrie. In the hands of anonymous content farms, the same technology manufactures fake bodies, fake arrests, and fake faces that torment her family and pollute the very evidence pool investigators are trying to navigate. So where does that leave the case today? Where the case stands now? As of the middle of June, more than 4 months after Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home, she remains missing. No suspect has been publicly named. No arrest has been made in connection with the abduction itself. There have been arrests around the edges of the case. A man in California was taken into custody by federal agents for allegedly sending a fake ransom text to Savannah Guthrie's family, an act of cruelty that authorities said was unrelated to the actual disappearance. Ransom notes demanding cryptocurrency circulated in the early weeks, some sent to media outlets, but authorities never confirmed any of them were genuinely connected to whoever took Nancy. Sheriff Nanos has urged the public to be patient, even as the slow pace has frustrated everyone watching. He has explained that the DNA testing the case depends on runs through labs on a timeline that cannot be rushed, and that the deliberate, careful approach is exactly what is needed to make sure that when an arrest comes, it is the right person. Nobody, he has stressed, wants to arrest the wrong person and let the real abductor walk free. For Savannah Guthrie, every morning is a battle between the job she has to do and the grief she cannot escape. She returns to that anchor desk and reports the news of the world, while the biggest story in her own life remains unsolved. She has said the Today Show gives her a brief distraction from the agony of not knowing, and she keeps making the same plea over and over to anyone who might be listening. If you know something, call. Say what you know. Somewhere out there is a person who covered a camera with leaves, who stood on an elderly woman's porch in the dark, and who knows exactly what happened to Nancy Guthrie. The investigators have more tools than they have ever had to find that person. The question now is whether the technology, the tips, and the time will finally come together before the trail goes cold. Nancy Guthrie is still missing, and her family is still waiting for the call that brings her home. If you have any information, contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department or the FBI. If you liked this, hit like and subscribe, and make sure to check out our other videos.